I remember the first time I came across Lindy Sue Biechler's story. It was one of those cases that sticks with you, a tale you can't quite shake. It wasn't just the brutality of her death. It was the questions, the gaps, the loose threads that seemed to taunt everyone who ever heard her name. A young woman, just 19 years old, full of life, married only a year, found dead in her apartment, stabbed repeatedly, left in a scene so chaotic, so horrifying, it etched itself into the minds of an entire community. Welcome to True Crime and Shadows, where we delve into the darkest corners of human nature and explore the chilling stories that often go untold. If you're fascinated by real-life mysteries, chilling crimes, and the secrets that lurk in the shadows, you're in the right place. Make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Your support helps keep these tales alive, and I can't wait to take you on this journey into the unknown. Thanks for joining me, and let's uncover the truth together. I thought to myself, how does something like this happen? How does someone commit a crime so brutal, so intimate, and yet remain free for nearly 5 decades? I started digging, and what I found wasn't just a story of murder. It was a story of loss, of obsession, of advances in science, and the persistence of those who refuse to give up on justice. On the evening of December 5th, 1975, Lindy Sue Biechler returned to her apartment, arms full of groceries. It was a normal day. The kind of day we all have. A few errands, maybe a quick stop at the store, then home. But Lindy never got to finish putting those groceries away. When her aunt and uncle walked into that apartment hours later, they found her lifeless body on the floor. Blood everywhere. A knife still lodged in her neck. I couldn't stop picturing it. The broken quiet of that small Pennsylvania apartment. The groceries scattered across the floor, a life full of potential brutally ended. It was as if everything about Lindy's world had been paused mid-sentence. What haunted me most, though, was how this case baffled investigators. How they worked day and night, following lead after lead, only to hit dead ends. How DNA evidence collected at the scene, something we now rely on to crack cases wide open, was practically useless in 1975. How for 47 years, her name became a whisper, a cold case, a haunting reminder of justice left undone. And then something changed. A breakthrough that no one could have predicted. A discovery that would lead investigators to a man who had walked free for decades. A man whose quiet existence masked the unimaginable. This is the story of Lindy Sue Biechler, a story that proves time doesn't erase the truth. It just waits for us to find it. Stay with me as we walk through this remarkable case, step by step, from that tragic December evening to the moment justice finally caught up with the killer. Lindy Sue Biechler wasn't just a name in a cold case file. She was a person, a daughter, a wife, a friend. At 19, she was newly married, just beginning a life that she and her husband had barely started building together. People who knew Lindy described her as bright and full of energy. She loved her family, her friends, and her community in Manor Township, Pennsylvania. There wasn't anything remarkable about her daily routine. She was the kind of person who blended into the fabric of a small, tight-knit town. December 5th, 1975, should have been an ordinary day for Lindy. She had run a few errands that evening, picking up groceries before heading back to the apartment she shared with her husband, Phil. He wasn't home that night, so Lindy was alone. She didn't know it then, but this ordinary day was about to become the last day of her life. When her aunt and uncle arrived at the apartment later that night, they weren't expecting anything unusual. They were worried because they hadn't heard from Lindy, but nothing could have prepared them for what they found. The door wasn't locked. Inside, the groceries Lindy had brought home were scattered across the floor, some of them still in their bags. Her body lay crumpled in the middle of the room. Blood was everywhere. She had been stabbed 19 times. The knife, an ordinary kitchen knife, was still lodged in her neck. Try to imagine what it must have been like to walk into that scene. To see someone you love, someone so full of life, reduced to a lifeless body in a pool of blood. The investigators, who arrived shortly after, said it was one of the most brutal and chaotic crime scenes they had ever witnessed. But the chaos told a story. Lindy hadn't gone down without a fight. There were clear signs of a struggle. She had fought her killer, fought for her life, but in the end, it wasn't enough. The attack was vicious, relentless, and personal. This wasn't the work of someone who simply wanted to rob her. This was something else entirely. The police began their investigation almost immediately. They ruled out robbery as a motive because nothing of value had been taken from the apartment. Her purse, her jewelry, even cash, it was all still there. And there were no signs of forced entry. That was one of the first chilling details. Whoever killed Lindy might have been someone she knew. Someone she trusted enough to let inside her apartment. As investigators combed through the scene, they found something that would become the cornerstone of this case decades later. A small bloodstain on Lindy's underwear. In 1975, forensic technology wasn't advanced enough to do much with it, but the investigators had the foresight to preserve it. At the time, it was just another piece of evidence. No one could have guessed it would one day solve the case. Detectives interviewed neighbors, friends, and family members. They followed every lead they could find, but nothing seemed to fit. Lindy didn't have any enemies. She wasn't involved in anything dangerous. She was, by all accounts, an ordinary young woman. So, who would do this to her? And why? The lack of answers frustrated investigators. It frustrated the community, too. In a small town like Manor Township, people weren't used to this kind of violence. Doors that were once left unlocked were suddenly bolted shut. Parents warned their children to be careful. Lindy's murder cast a long shadow, one that lingered for years. The evidence collected at the scene, including the killer's DNA, was carefully logged and stored. But in 1975, DNA wasn't the game-changing tool it is today. It was simply a detail, a puzzle piece that didn't seem to fit anywhere. The police did everything they could with the tools they had. They followed countless leads, interviewed dozens of suspects, and pieced together a timeline of Lindy's last hours. But despite their best efforts, they couldn't find her killer. It's easy, with the benefit of hindsight, to wonder what might have been done differently. Could more have been done to secure the scene? Were there witnesses who were overlooked? What role did the limitations of 1970s forensic science play in allowing this case to go unsolved for so long? What do you think investigators should have done differently back in 1975? Could this case have been solved earlier if handled differently? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. For nearly 47 years, Lindy Sue Biechler's murder remained a mystery. The leads ran dry. The evidence sat in storage. But as the decades passed, something remarkable was happening in the world of forensic science. Something that would finally break this case wide open. Stay with me. For the investigators working Lindy Sue Biechler's murder, the initial weeks after the crime were critical. Leads poured in. Tips came from neighbors, friends, and even strangers who thought they might know something. Detectives interviewed dozens of people and followed every possible angle. But none of it led them to Lindy's killer. Time is a cruel force in cases like this. With every passing week, every unanswered question, the trail grew colder. Witnesses moved away or forgot small but crucial details. Evidence, though carefully preserved, sat in storage, waiting for a breakthrough that never came. The investigators who had started the case so determined, so hopeful, began to hit dead end after dead end. By the late 1970s, the case was officially cold. And for Lindy's family, the unanswered questions weren't just frustrating, they were devastating. Her parents, who had raised her, watched helplessly as the years went by with no justice for their daughter. Her husband, Phil, who was so young when he lost her, had to rebuild a life that had been shattered before it had even begun. Can you imagine what that must have been like? To know someone took the life of your child, your wife, your friend, and to have no answers? The grief never truly faded for them. It hung over every holiday, every family gathering, every moment that should have been filled with Lindy's laughter. The emotional toll didn't stop with Lindy's family. This was a small community. People knew each other, trusted each other. And then, seemingly out of nowhere, one of their own was brutally murdered. The fear and paranoia lingered for years. Was the killer still living among them? Could it happen again? In 1975, investigators did everything they could with the tools available to them. But the limitations of forensic science in that era were stark. Fingerprints, blood types, fibers. These were the cornerstones of crime scene investigation. DNA technology, as we know it today, was still decades away. The bloodstain found on Lindy's underwear? In 1975, it was little more than a frustrating clue. Investigators knew it was important, but they didn't have the means to unlock its secrets. And while DNA evidence has become a game-changer for modern investigations at the time, it was simply a fragment of a puzzle that no one knew how to solve. As the years turned into decades, Lindy's murder became one of Pennsylvania's oldest unsolved cases. Her name and the details of her death were occasionally brought up in the media, usually as a footnote in stories about other cold cases. For many, she became a symbol of how justice can be delayed, not by lack of effort, but by the limits of technology and the passage of time. But even as the case faded from public memory, it never truly went away. Detectives who had worked on it carried it with them throughout their careers. Some retired still haunted by the unanswered questions. Others handed the case off to younger investigators, hoping that a fresh perspective might lead to something new. And through it all, Lindy's family never stopped hoping for answers. They never stopped pushing for justice. It's in moments like this, as the years stretch into decades, that we have to ask ourselves, what should we do with cases like Lindy's? Should we ever give up on them? Should every unsolved case remain open until it's solved, no matter how much time has passed or how slim the chances might seem? What do you think? Should cold cases like Lindy Sue Biechler's always remain open, no matter how long it takes to find the truth? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. For 47 years, Lindy's case remained in the shadows. But in the background, science was evolving. New techniques were being developed. Techniques that would one day bring investigators closer to Lindy's killer than anyone could have imagined. Stay with me as we uncover how decades of silence finally gave way to the truth. For decades, Lindy Sue Biechler's case remained in the cold case files. Every lead had been exhausted, every theory explored. But what no one knew in 1975 was that time, normally the enemy of unsolved cases, was quietly working in Lindy's favor. By the 1980s, a revolutionary advancement was on the horizon. DNA analysis had entered the crime-solving arena, forever changing the way investigators approached evidence. In the early days, the technology was primitive by today's standards. It could only confirm basic genetic profiles. But by the 1990s, scientists had begun to refine the process. DNA wasn't just a biological fingerprint anymore. It was the key to unlocking long unsolved mysteries. Fast forward to the early 2000s, and forensic genealogy emerged as a game changer. Unlike traditional DNA matching, which required a direct sample from a suspect or close relative, forensic genealogy uses publicly available genealogy databases to build a family tree. By tracing shared DNA markers, investigators could identify potential suspects even if they were several degrees removed from the person who left evidence at the crime scene. Here's how it works. Imagine a drop of blood found at a crime scene. Investigators extract the DNA and upload the profile to a genealogy database, one where people voluntarily upload their own DNA to learn about their ancestry. These databases then reveal possible familial matches, maybe a distant cousin or even a great-aunt. From there, forensic genealogists use traditional genealogical research methods, such as public records and family trees, to zero in on a specific individual. For Lindy's case, the breakthrough came in 2022. Investigators decided to revisit the preserved DNA evidence, the bloodstain on Lindy's underwear. This time, they didn't just test it against local criminal databases. Instead, they turned to forensic genealogy. The process was meticulous. It started with a simple question. Could this DNA be linked to any family anywhere? The answer was yes. Through painstaking research, genealogists traced the crime scene DNA to an extended family tree. That tree eventually pointed them toward one man, David Sinopoli. Sinopoli wasn't a stranger to Manor Township. In fact, back in 1975, he had lived in the same apartment complex as Lindy. He had been in his 20s then, quiet and unassuming. He didn't have a significant criminal record, and there had been nothing at the time to connect him to Lindy's murder. But the DNA told a different story. Once investigators had a name, they needed evidence, something concrete to confirm that Sinopoli was the man they had been searching for all these years. Surveillance was set up, and detectives waited for an opportunity to collect a sample of his DNA. It finally came when Sinopoli discarded a coffee cup. Think about this for a moment. Decades after the crime, with technology unimaginable in 1975, investigators were able to pick up a piece of trash, a simple coffee cup, and use it to solve a murder. The DNA from the coffee cup was compared to the crime scene evidence. It was a match. Not just any match, a perfect match. It was an extraordinary moment, one that would have been impossible without the combined power of forensic genealogy and decades of persistence. For Lindy's family, it was the breakthrough they had been praying for. For investigators, it was proof that justice, no matter how delayed, was still possible. What do you think about the use of genealogy databases to solve crimes like Lindy Sue Biechler's? Should there be restrictions on how this technology is used, or is it a necessary tool for justice? Share your thoughts in the comments below. David Sinopoli's arrest was a monumental moment, but it raised as many questions as it answered. Who was this man who had lived quietly for nearly 47 years after committing such a brutal act? What had driven him to kill Lindy? And what kind of life had he led since that terrible night in 1975? In the next part of this story, we'll uncover the details of Sinopoli's life and the events leading to his arrest. Stay with me. July 17, 2022, was a day that brought a shocking sense of closure to one of Pennsylvania's oldest cold cases. On that day, David Sinopoli, a 68-year-old man who had lived an unremarkable life for decades, was arrested in connection with Lindy Sue Biechler's murder. The arrest wasn't dramatic. There were no high-speed chases or standoffs. Instead, it was the culmination of meticulous work by investigators who had followed the trail left by Sinopoli's DNA. The same man who had quietly discarded a coffee cup, unaware that it would seal his fate, now found himself at the center of a decades-old murder mystery. At the time of his arrest, Sinopoli was living in East Hempfield Township, Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, just miles from where Lindy had been killed in 1975. For nearly 47 years, he had managed to evade suspicion, blending into the fabric of the community. He had no significant criminal record, no history that would have flagged him as a potential suspect. So who was David Sinopoli? Investigators pieced together his background, uncovering details about his life during and after the murder. Back in 1975, Sinopoli was in his mid-20s and lived in the same apartment complex as Lindy Sue Biechler. It's chilling to think about how close their lives were intertwined. Neighbors living just doors apart, yet separated by a horrific act of violence. Sinopoli was described by those who knew him at the time as quiet, unassuming, someone who didn't draw attention to himself. For nearly 5 decades, Sinopoli lived what appeared to be a normal life. He worked, he interacted with others, and he built a life that, on the surface, seemed completely ordinary. But what lay beneath that calm exterior? What kind of person could commit such a brutal act and then carry on as though nothing had happened? When police revisited the details of Lindy's murder, one potential motive began to emerge: sexual obsession. Although there was no evidence of sexual assault, investigators believed the attack was sexually motivated. Sinopoli's actions that night, the brutality of the stabbing, the specific evidence left behind, suggested a deep and disturbing fixation. The lack of an actual assault complicates the psychology of this crime. If Sinopoli's motives were sexual, why didn't he follow through with the act? Was he interrupted? Did he panic? Or was the violence itself part of the gratification? These are questions that remain unanswered, leaving a troubling glimpse into the mind of a man who carried this dark secret for so long. And then there's the question of his life after the murder. Did Sinopoli ever feel remorse? Did he ever worry about being caught? Or did he convince himself that he had gotten away with it, that Lindy's death was a secret he would take to his grave? What do you think drives individuals like David Sinopoli to commit such heinous acts? Do you believe it's a momentary lapse of control or something much deeper, more sinister? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Sinopoli's arrest answered one of the biggest questions surrounding Lindy Sue Biechler's murder: who had committed the crime? But it also left many others in its wake. As we move forward, we'll explore the legal process that followed his arrest, the reactions from Lindy's family and community, and the broader implications of solving a cold case nearly 5 decades later. Don't go anywhere. David Sinopoli's arrest in July 2022 was a monumental moment in a case that had haunted Lindy Sue Biechler's family and the Manor Township community for nearly half a century. But it was only the beginning of the legal battle to ensure that justice would finally be served. The evidence against Sinopoli was compelling, anchored by the DNA match that investigators had confirmed using cutting-edge forensic genealogy. The same genetic material recovered from Lindy's underwear in 1975 now linked directly to Sinopoli, providing irrefutable proof of his presence at the crime scene. During the trial, prosecutors laid out the details of Lindy's brutal murder. They described the events leading up to her death: the young newlywed returning home from grocery shopping, the violent struggle in her apartment, and the gruesome scene that her aunt and uncle discovered later that evening. The prosecution meticulously presented the evidence gathered from the crime scene, including the 19 stab wounds, the knife left lodged in Lindy's neck, and the DNA that had been preserved for decades. Sinopoli's defense team faced an uphill battle, with the DNA evidence serving as the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. The defense attempted to question the reliability of forensic genealogy and the handling of evidence over such a long period. But these arguments struggled to gain traction in the face of overwhelming scientific proof. The trial was more than just a legal proceeding. It was a deeply emotional experience for Lindy's family. After 47 years of unanswered questions, they finally had a name, a face, and the beginning of closure. Family members attended the trial, often wiping away tears as they listened to the details of Lindy's final moments. The community, too, was deeply affected by the trial. Manor Township, a place that had been defined by this unsolved mystery for decades, was finally seeing the promise of resolution. Local residents expressed a mixture of relief and disbelief. For some, it was hard to reconcile the quiet, unassuming man they knew as David Sinopoli with the brutal murder described in court. As the trial progressed, the question of sentencing loomed large. In cases like these, where the crime was committed decades earlier, legal complexities often arise. Would Sinopoli face the full weight of justice for a crime committed in 1975? While the final sentencing outcomes may still be unfolding, the overwhelming evidence and public sentiment made it clear that this case was heading toward a resolution that Lindy's family and community had long awaited. The trial also highlighted the remarkable role of technology and law enforcement persistence in solving cold cases. Without advancements in forensic genealogy, Lindy's murder might have remained unsolved. Investigators, genealogists, and scientists all played a crucial role in ensuring that justice, though delayed, would not be denied. This case brings up an important question. Do you believe that justice delayed is justice denied? Or does the resolution of a decades-old mystery like this prove that it's never too late for justice? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. With the trial behind us, we're left to reflect on the larger impact of solving this case, not just for Lindy's family and community, but for the broader field of criminal justice. The story of Lindy Sue Biechler's murder is not just a tale of one woman's tragic death and a decades-long search for justice. It's a story that speaks to the broader evolution of forensic science and law enforcement, and the unyielding persistence of those who refuse to give up on the truth. Lindy's case was solved in a way that no one in 1975 could have predicted. Back then, the technology to track a killer through genealogy simply didn't exist. DNA evidence was in its infancy, and law enforcement struggled to connect the dots between physical evidence and potential suspects. But today, with the rise of forensic genealogy, cold cases like Lindy's can be reopened and solved, even when the trail has long gone cold. The role of forensic genealogy in solving crimes is revolutionary. By using publicly available DNA databases, investigators can now trace distant relatives of a suspect, creating a genetic family tree that ultimately leads to the perpetrator. In the case of Lindy Sue Biechler, this advanced technology transformed what seemed like an unsolvable mystery into a story of justice and closure. But it wasn't just the technology that made this case possible. It was the persistence of law enforcement, the dedication of forensic genealogists, and the tireless efforts of those who refused to let the case be forgotten. Even after 47 years, they never stopped seeking answers. Lindy's family, too, never gave up on the hope that one day, the person responsible for her murder would be brought to justice. For Lindy's family, the closure they received in 2022 wasn't just about bringing the killer to trial. It was about finally knowing who took their loved one from them. It was about the long-awaited acknowledgement of their pain, their grief, and the years they spent wondering if they would ever find out what really happened to their daughter, sister, and niece. After nearly half a century, they were able to honor Lindy's memory properly, knowing that the person who ended her life would finally be held accountable. In the larger context of criminal justice, Lindy's case serves as a powerful reminder. Cold cases are never truly closed, and justice is never out of reach. The impact of this case on forensic science cannot be overstated. It shows the incredible potential of modern technology to solve crimes and bring peace to families. It also reinforces the idea that no matter how long it takes, the truth will eventually surface. While the legal process has unfolded, it's important to remember the human element behind it all. Lindy Sue Biechler was more than just a name in a cold case file. She was a vibrant young woman with a promising future, whose life was stolen too soon. Her memory lives on in the hearts of her loved ones, and in the minds of those who followed her story, ensuring that her legacy continues to have meaning. Lindy's case has brought closure to a family, but there are so many other cold cases that remain unsolved. Which other cold cases would you like us to explore? Let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts and suggestions for future investigations. As we close the chapter on Lindy Sue Biechler's heartbreaking story, we reflect on a journey that began with a brutal, unsolved murder in 1975 and ended with the stunning arrest of David Sinopoli in 2022. It's a journey marked by decades of uncertainty, the relentless pursuit of justice, and the remarkable power of modern forensic science. From the moment Lindy's body was discovered in her apartment, her family and the local community were thrust into a nightmare. For nearly 47 years, the case remained unsolved. Countless leads were followed, numerous suspects were questioned, and the cold case file gathered dust. But technology has a way of pushing boundaries, and in this case, the advent of forensic genealogy revolutionized the investigation. It was this breakthrough in science that led to the identification of David Sinopoli, the quiet, unassuming man who had lived near Lindy at the time of her murder. The investigation into his family tree using genetic databases was a game changer. It was an act of persistence, determination, and ingenuity, showing us how far law enforcement and technology have come since the 1970s. The long-awaited arrest of Sinopoli in 2022 brought the justice Lindy's family had waited for, justice that was decades in the making. But this case isn't just about the triumph of solving a decades-old mystery. It underscores the importance of not giving up on cold cases. As we've seen in Lindy's case, justice may be delayed, but it's never out of reach. It's a powerful reminder that persistence, new technologies, and the dedication of those committed to uncovering the truth can overcome even the longest of delays. As we reflect on the lessons learned from Lindy's case, it's clear that the role of technology in modern criminal investigations cannot be overstated. Forensic genealogy has proven to be an invaluable tool in solving cold cases, offering hope to families who have waited years, sometimes decades, for answers. The impact of these advancements in criminal science will continue to shape the future of law enforcement and justice. Before we wrap up, I want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on the use of forensic genealogy in solving crimes? Do you think it's a breakthrough, or does it raise ethical concerns? Let us know in the comments below. And if you've got any other cold cases that you'd like to see us explore, I want to know. Your suggestions mean a lot to us and could help guide our future investigations. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our upcoming stories. We've got a lot more gripping, true crime cases to cover, and you won't want to miss them. Remember, justice may be delayed, but it's never out of reach. Until next time, stay safe and vigilant.